Welcome to the Clinical File. I'm John Cordray. I'm a licensed professional counselor, and this is my mental health analysis of the Karen Read case. I will be focusing on the main mental health and psychological indicators while providing the backstory. I don't just talk about the crimes, I talk about the psychology behind the crimes and the mysteries that captivate us. I look beyond the facts of the case to understand the why of the crime. My analysis is based on my speculations, not a diagnosis of anyone involved in this case. I also want to mention that this central figure in this case was acquitted and found not guilty of this crime. This is only my analysis of the behaviors around the case. Can a person truly convince themselves of a reality that never happened as a defense mechanism against trauma they cannot process? How does a high-achieving professional transition from a night of social drinking to a state of absolute psychological fragmentation in a matter of hours? If we look at the behavioral patterns leading up to the early morning hours of January 29, 2022, we see a complex intersection of a relationship strain and emotional volatility. The promise of this analysis is to uncover how perception, memory, and intense emotional distress can cloud the truth of what happened on that frozen lawn in Canton, Massachusetts. We are looking at the evidence not just through a legal lens, but through a clinical one to see why the human mind reacts with such extreme measures when faced with the unthinkable tragedy. The story begins in the evening hours of January 28, 2022, when Karen Read and her boyfriend, John O'Keefe, a respected Boston police officer, were out with friends. They were seen at a social establishment like the C.F. McCarthy's and the Waterfall Bar and Grill, appearing like any other couple on a Friday night. However, investigators later pointed to a history of tension in the relationship, which serves as a first psychological indicator, the presence of high conflict dynamics and emotional instability. A relationship characterized by frequent intense arguments can create a baseline of chronic stress that impairs rational decision-making during a crisis. What happens to the psyche when a person is operating under the dual influence of significant alcohol consumption and a simmering interpersonal resentment? By midnight, the couple decided to head to an after-party at the home of another police officer. The prosecution alleged that Read never actually entered that house, but instead struck O'Keefe with her Lexus SUV while making the three-point turn. From a mental health perspective, the why here often involves a phenomenon known as intermittent explosive reaction, where a moment of intense anger bypasses the prefrontal cortex, leading to a disastrous impulsive action. If she did strike him, was it a moment of blind rage fueled by perceived abandonment, or was it a tragic accident that her mind immediately tried to overwrite? The next few hours were a psychological maze of frantic behavior of what some might call memory shielding. Read returned to O'Keefe's home, and by 5 a.m. she was making frantic phone calls to friends, reportedly screaming that John hadn't come home. This brings us to another red flag: the use of projection and leading questions as a way to externalize internal guilt or confusion. According to witnesses, Read was heard asking, "Could I have hit him?" or "Did a plow hit him?" before the body was even located. In clinical terms, this can be viewed as rehearsed reality, where an individual tests different narratives to see which one alleviates their psychological distress most effectively. Is it possible for the mind to create a conspiracy as a protective barrier to avoid the weight of an accidental killing? When Read, accompanied by two friends, returned to the home around 6 a.m., she was the one who spotted O'Keefe's body, partially covered in the snow. The physical state of the scene was gruesome, and O'Keefe had suffered blunt force trauma to the head and was severely hyperthermic. The behavior Read displayed at the scene, distraught, screaming, and allegedly performing CPR while having blood on her face, is often scrutinized for its authenticity. In a psychological analysis, we look for affect congruence, or whether the emotional display matches the situation. While her grief appeared overwhelming, Critics of her behavior point to an over-explanation of her actions as a potential sign of cognitive dissonance. Why would a person's first instinct be to suggest that they were being framed by a group of fellow law enforcement officers? The defense theory introduced a massive psychological pivot, the idea of a wide-reaching cover-up involving the homeowners and the investigators. They argued that O'Keefe was actually beaten inside the house and moved to the lawn, suggesting that the injuries on his arm were dog bites from a German Shepherd in the home. The shift in the narrative represents a psychological defense called externalization of blame, which is often seen in individuals who cannot reconcile their self-image with a negative event. By creating a them versus me scenario, the individual finds a sense of purpose and a way to channel their anxiety into a fight for survival. The investigation itself was soon under fire, specifically the conduct of a trooper Michael Proctor. Proctor's personal derogatory text about Reed to his friends and colleagues revealed a significant bias that complicated the psychological profile of the entire case. From a behavioral standpoint, this unprofessionalism fed directly into the prosecutor's delusion or conspiracy narrative that the defense was building. When the authorities behave badly, it validates a suspect's psychological need to feel like a victim rather than a perpetrator. Is the Free Karen Reed movement a search for justice or a collective psychological phenomenon fueled by a distrust of authority? The trial, which began in April 2024 with a spectacle of conflicting expert testimonies and intense public emotion. The prosecution presented data from a Lexus SUV showing the vehicle reversed at a high speed, while the defense provided experts who claimed the injuries were inconsistent with a vehicle strike. As a counselor, I find the commitment to a narrative fascinating. Once a person publicly commits to a version of the events, the brain will often filter out the evidence to the contrary. This is known as confirmation bias, and in this case, it seemed to affect not just the defendant, but the public and the jury as well. In July 2024, the first trial ended in a hung jury, further extending the psychological toll on everyone involved. The liminal space of a mistrial, being neither guilty nor innocent in the eyes of the law, can cause extreme psychological erosion. For Reed, this meant another year of living under the shadow of a second-degree murder charge, which likely reinforced her defense mode behavior. On June 18, 2025, after the second intense trial, the jury finally reached a verdict that reflected the complexity of the psychological and physical evidence. Reed was acquitted of the most serious charges, including second-degree murder and manslaughter. However, she was found guilty of a lesser offense, operating a motor vehicle under the influence. This outcome suggests the jury found evidence of her impairment, but not necessarily the intent or the direct causation for the death. From a clinical perspective, the conviction confirms the presence of substance use as a contributing factor to that night's chaos. Alcohol acts as a chemical disinhibitor, meaning that whatever psychological tensions were present in the relationship were likely amplified tenfold that night. How does one reconcile the feeling of being vindicated on murder charges while still being legally responsible for the actions that led up to the tragedy? Even after the acquittal, the psychological impact remains, as O'Keefe's family has pursued a wrongful death civil lawsuit that is expected to continue into 2026. The ongoing litigation means the trauma is never allowed to scab over, keeping all parties in a state of hypervigilance and emotional exhaustion. In victimology, we see the lack of closure in such a high-profile disputed case can lead to a prolonged grief disorder for the family. They are forced to watch the person they believe is responsible celebrate a legal victory, which creates a profound sense of injustice. Looking at the behaviors of anyone involved, we must consider the groupthink that occurs in the tight-knit communities like the Canton police circles. When a tragedy occurs within a tribe, the psychological instinct is often to protect the tribe at all costs, which can inadvertently lead to very cover-up suspicions. This case wasn't just about a broken taillight or a body in the snow. It was about the collision of two different psychological realities. On one side, you may have a woman who may have been experiencing a blackout or a dissociative break, and on the other, an investigation that was tainted by personal bias. What does it say about our society when a murder trial becomes a source of entertainment and team-based fandom? The psychological indicator here is a dehumanization of the victim, John O'Keefe. Amidst the free Karen Reed signs and the TikTok theories, the fact that a man lost his life in a brutal, cold environment was often overshadowed by the legal drama. As a counselor, I see this as a societal defense mechanism. It's easier to focus on the conspiracy than to face the reality of a domestic tragedy. We choose the narrative that is most engaging rather than the one that is most grounded in the quiet, painful truth. Throughout the legal proceedings, Reed's demeanor was often described as stoic or defiant. In my speculation, this could be a fronting technique, a psychological armor used to project strength when one feels most vulnerable. If she truly believed she was being framed, this defiance was a logical response to a perceived existential threat. However, if there was any subconscious awareness of involvement, that same stoicism serves as a mask to prevent any leakage of guilt. The final psychological red flag is the persistence of the alternate reality, even after the legal system has spoken. Karen Reed has filed her own lawsuits alleging a conspiracy by law enforcement, showing a total immersion in her role as a whistleblower. This indicates a personality that, when under fire, doubles down rather than retreats. It's a survival trait that can be both a person's greatest strength and their most complex psychological hurdle. The case of Karen Reed remains one of the most polarizing stories in recent history because it taps into our deepest fears about justice, betrayal, and the reliability of our own minds. We see the devastating effects of what happens when a relationship's emotional baseline is replaced by a crisis baseline. In the end, we are left with a man who is gone and a woman who is legally free of murder, but bound to a story that will likely define her for the rest of her life. Understanding the why requires us to look at the fragility of memory and the power of the stories we tell ourselves to survive. This case has gotten a lot of attention over the last several years, even into 2026. And it's high profile. There's a mystery here. There's not enough evidence, obviously, for the jury to convict Reed. She was acquitted for the murder, but we do know she was drinking that night. And so we have to put the pieces together, but we have to remember it's all circumstantial at this point. We don't have the evidence, or at least it's not public right now. There's a lot of litigation going on currently, so there's not a lot of information there. I just wanted to look at this case based on behavior and offer my speculation. It's not a pointing the finger at anybody in this case, but it's very interesting to be able to look at the psychological and mental health behaviors and indicators. So what did you think about this case? Were there any elements that stood out to you? If you want more mental health analysis of true crime stories like this one, be sure to subscribe for more. And if you found this case compelling, be sure to watch this next story. It will make you more aware of your surroundings. Thank you for joining me today. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe.